Welcome to AWAI's Great Books Club with your host, Marcella, Allison.
Hey everyone, I want to welcome you to our first AWAI's Great Books Club session of a brand new year, 2015, and I am super excited about this year because we have got some really great books coming up. And we're kicking it off with a classic, something that every writer should have on their desk, and that is The Elements of Style. And today I have as my special guest Gordon Graham. Gordon actually suggested this book in an email to me, I don't know, 5-6 months ago, Gordon? Does that seem right?
Yeah.
And I want to tell you a little bit about Gordon. Gordon's made his living as a writer since 1979. He's written for newspapers, magazines, newsletters, and just about every kind of B2B content, blog posts, video scripts. He's won many awards doing it. Today, he's known, especially to the AWAI audience, as the white paper guy because he focuses mainly on white paper, those long-form persuasive essays that are used to promote B2B products and services. Gordon has written well over 200 white papers for clients from Australia to Finland on everything from enterprise software to designing online worlds from kids, for big companies, small companies, and everything in between. And I am super excited to have Gordon with us today. And I'm super excited to be doing this book because honestly, I will confess, it's not one that I had on my desk. I actually went to the University of Chicago, and we always use the Chicago Manual of Style, which is nowhere near as fun or as entertaining as this one, let me tell you. So I was really thrilled when you suggested this, Gordon, and I'm really excited to work on this one today. I wanted to start out by just saying a little bit about the two authors, and then Gordon, I know you mentioned to me that you had a couple stories about this book and how it came to be that you'd heard over the years. So if you have anything you want to chime in with, feel free. So William Strunk Jr. was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. I have to give a big shout out because, of course, I am in Cincinnati, Ohio. So there you go. He went to the University of Cincinnati and Cornell, and he was a professor of English at Cornell. And that's where he authored and actually self-published long before self-publishing was the modus operandi of the day for writers. He self-published The Elements of Style in 1918 for his students, and they called it The Little Book. And one of his students was who we know as E.B. White, the lovely author of Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little, which of course I had to read as a kid. So right there, he's one of my favorites. E.B. White also graduated from Cornell, was a student, as I said, of Professor Strunk. He worked at the New Yorker and used this little book, actually re-edited it, cleaned it up a little bit, not too much. And now we have the famous Elements of Style, which has been used by just about anyone and everyone since it's been published. And Gordon, when you picked this book, maybe just say a few words about why you picked this book and why you think it's so important, just briefly, that we have this book on our desk, why it matters.
Well, for me personally, it's the only style manual I need, and I kind of dip into it. I guess I'm a bit of a word nerd, but I kind of dip into it for inspiration, and I really like the rules, you know. And I find that when it's very, very terse and small, and you can sit there and read like one page and get a little jolt. I can get a little jolt of inspiration. Use the active voice, and they have like a page and a half about the active voice with some examples, and that is just great. It just is kind of a nice little break. And when you work, as a copywriter, as a freelance copywriter, sort of in your own office without colleagues, you don't get that much feedback, except you get this kind of amateur feedback from your clients who aren't professional editors and sometimes don't know how to articulate their comments that well. So you may get back comments that are just they're all over the map, and they're not expressed in sometimes a very very specific way. And I find that having Strunk and White on my desk is kind of like having a couple of colleagues in my office that I can commiserate with and say, yeah, there they go again, using the passive voice, and telling me to use the passive voice.
That is really a great way to put it, and I really I identified with that too. I found I think you can use many of these rules as a checklist in a sense to make sure that you're doing the best possible job on your writing. We're going to dig into a few of both of our favorites today and talk about why these lessons are so important, including active voice. I'm going to let you all know, I don't think you'll have any problems following us no matter what version of this book you have, and there's many, and many of you may still have it from your college days or your high school days even. I chose this delightful, quirky new edition, which is the same good old The Elements of Style, but it has some very fun illustrations by Coleman. And I did that because I think, sometimes we think of grammar books as being dry and painful and, oh, my God, rules, 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 But really, he has a delightful sense of humor that comes through the page. And many of the examples are funny and quirky. And I love how she adds just a little bit of playfulness to the text. So don't worry, because I'm going to give you the section and the number, so this is principle number 8 or principle number 9. So no matter what version of this book you have, you'll be able to follow along with us. So if you don't have the illustrated one, don't panic, but I think you'll have fun and enjoy some of these cute little illustrations, 2 of which you've already seen as our authors as we kicked it off. So I want to start out by talking about the elementary principles of composition. And this forms really the meat of the book here. And one of the ones that, Gordon, I know you picked right off the bat when we talked about this is the choose a suitable design and hold to it. And this is principle number 12. And the main reason, I love this is one of her quirky illustrations, a basic structural design underlines every kind of writing. And this is a quote I liked a lot that I think can kick us off a little bit here, Gordon, and then I want you to dive deeper into this. I loved this explanation, really, of why we need a structure. A sonnet is built on a 14-line frame, each line containing 5 feet. Hence, sonneteers, I didn't even know that was a word, sonneteers know exactly where they are headed, although they may not know how to get there. Most forms of composition are less clearly defined, more flexible, but all have skeletons to which the writer will bring the flesh and the blood. The more clearly the writer perceives the shape, the better are the chances of success. So I know none of us, or I suspect few of us, are writing sonnets for our clients, but Gordon, if you could talk just briefly about why knowing the architecture, having this frame is so important.
Well, I guess that there are many different sort of formats of writing, and I've done a lot of different writing. I've written for newspapers, with a traditional sort of inverted pyramid style, where you put all the who, what, why, where, what, when, right in the first paragraph, and then you sort of trail off to the end. And I've written lots of other formats, and to me, I used to notice some writers would really hesitate and stumble whenever they had to switch formats. Say they were writing a technical manual and then they had to write an FAQ. They would sort of a list of frequently asked questions, say, which is still technical content, but it's formatted a totally different way as a question and then an answer. And I would find that the writers that were flexible and that realized, okay, I'm writing a different format, here's what I've got to do, would have far more success than the ones that would try to use their old rules, their old formats on the new situation. So these days we have so many different formats floating around. There are at least 20 different types of content being used by B2B companies, and that's just on the content side. On the sales side, there's probably another 20. So each one has some classic ways to structure it. I think you have to really look under your nose and look at what you're trying to write and adapt your approach, adapt the design of the structure according to the piece that you're actually working on, according to the format you're working on. If you can do that, then I think that you'll have more success as a writer. So for example, there's lots of different ways to structure any piece of content, but for certain types, certain formats, some are better than others. So I mentioned the inverted pyramid, which is really ideal for something like a news story or a press release, which you might be writing for one of your clients. Another really classic format is before and after. Before we had this terrible problem, then we found this wonderful product or service to help us. Now everything is so much better. In fact, we have some numbers showing us how much better it is than the way it was before. That is the classic structure for a case study or a success.
You see those a lot in, I see those a lot in weight loss or in the fitness program systems. I see a lot of those.
For sure, it's the most logical way of all to do that type of story. But then there's if you're trying to describe some kind of process or some kind of workflow, or a chronology. You really want to start at the beginning and work your way, logically through the middle and to the end. But that isn't the most powerful way to structure everything. If you try to write a news story like that, this is the failing of beginning cub reporters who go to a long sort of council meeting and write it up and then the first order of business was we voted about putting up a new stop sign. That's not how you write.
People are asleep before they get to the end.
Yep. For that, you really got to put the most important thing at the top and forget the chronology. So you have to be able to be flexible and switch around. And the final one, just as an example here, is arguing for a certain angle or a certain view of the world very passionately. And this is an ideal way to structure something like a blog post or even a white paper. You've got to take a position and then argue for your position, which is completely different than, the inverted pyramid or the before and after.
Right. You know what I really liked? I want to jump to our next slide here because I think we've talked about the various design choices, but this, you wrote this to me in a little email as we were talking about the book, and I think this is absolutely essential, that you can't reverse engineer it. You have to know your design before you begin writing it.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think this falls exactly into what Strunk and White are telling us. Choose a suitable design and then stick to it. Now, it doesn't mean that if your design isn't working, you can't switch it, but I sometimes make a list and say, well, here's a story I'm trying to write. I could write it like this. I could write it like that. I could write it the other way. I'll just start with this one because it seems like the most likely way. And if that falls through, I've already thought of 2 alternate designs, so I don't have to waste the rest of the afternoon going, oh, geez, what do I do now? Oh boy, that first one didn't work out. You can have a list and then just pick your best choice from it, and understand.
I think this is absolutely brilliant. And I don't write white papers, but I do write sidebars for large magalogs. And when you're taking an article and you're writing a sidebar about it, there's lots of ways you can do that. And so you can write it as a story. You could talk about this groundbreaking medical discovery. You could start by scaring them. Do you know that the chances of, you dying of a heart attack before you're 50 are this? There's sort of all sorts of ways to structure a sidebar given a set of information or an article that you have that you're starting with. And I find that I do this all the time. It's sort of like a puzzle. I do try to have a list. I'm like, oh, well, I could tell this as a discovery story from the point of view of the scientist who figured it out, or I could tell the story of someone who was cured by this thing, or I could make this a mystery and I could talk about this amazing vitamin that does all these things and then actually not reveal it and just tease that they were going to have to buy the book to find out. And so I do the same thing, but like you, sometimes I have to actually write it to figure out that that one's not working, and then I go on to the next one on my list. And I think no matter what type of writing you're doing, whether you're doing a white paper or let's say you're about to do a financial promotion, One thing that I found very helpful when trying to figure out the architecture of a promotion is to take a winning control, a winning piece of copy in the space in which you're writing, whether it's a fantastic white paper or it's a great B2B ad or it's a B2C magalog like I work on, and to actually look at the structure of it. And those of you who've taken the AWAI course, I believe it's the first course. When you do that, you see a section in there. I wish Katie was on the call because she could save me right now for my blunder. But that's where you go through, and with your pen, you say, okay, here the writer is introducing the product. Here the writer is comparing the price to something that's less expensive. Here the writer is, and you just sort of like document what they're doing all the way down the right-hand side. And I'm sure that people could do that, I'm guessing, for a white paper too. You know, here he's introducing the concept, here he's explaining it. And that gives you an outline that then you can follow for your own project, and you can just keep it right next to you, and it doesn't have to be a mystery. I mean, that's how I learned to do my first financial promotion, is I step by step followed the outline I'd made of a current control. Have you found that to be true in white papers also, Gordon?
Oh, absolutely. There's a format that I kind of inherited bits and pieces of from a couple of other writers, but then I developed the kind of format for the three main types, what I call the three main types, and they all have certain sections that you want to put in, and within those sections you want to accomplish a certain goal. So I think that's a really good a bit of advice to reverse engineer successful samples, and instead of just reading them and looking at the surface, really go under the surface and look at what they're doing structurally, because I think this is where a lot of writers get into problems. You know, like I hear about people having writer's block, and I'm sorry, I'm not that sympathetic, because I kind of think if you've done your research and you know the structure that you're trying to follow, if you get stuck on one bit, you can just go on to the next, you know, and I do that. I mean,
that's a great point. I think that's a great idea. So do your research, make your outline based on a sample that's very similar to the piece that you are writing, and then what you can do is plug and play. If you're not ready to do the whole thing, or you're not sure what you're doing in your headline or your opening, you write the guarantee, you know, and that allows you to go ahead and put that little puzzle piece in. I want to cover some more of these principles. I want to move on and keep us going, but I do think this idea of a structure is critical. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is one that you brought up at the beginning when we first kicked this off, which is the idea of using the active voice. And let me give you an example for those of you who are wondering what I'm talking about. This is from the book. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. So example one, I shall always remember my first visit to Boston is active, whereas my first visit to Boston will always be remembered by me is passive. Now, active voice, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, has power. It's my friend Richard calls it muscular. It has energy to it. Passive removes the person doing the action, and so there's a couple ways you can see whether you're using active voice or not. The first thing that I was taught was to use the Fleisch-Kincaid scale, which you can get as part of your spell check in Microsoft Word, and that will tell you what percentage of sentences are passive voice. You're rarely going to be able to get to 0, right? Because there are certain times when you're constructing a sentence when you have to use the passive voice because you want to keep your subject similar, or maybe you don't know who's doing the action, but you really want to keep that percentage as low as possible. The other thing you can do is you can, this was one of the first things one of my mentors taught me, was just start searching for all the to-be verbs, right? Because that'll clue you in that you've got a passive sentence. And then look at that sentence to figure out how you can make it active. Do you find, Gordon, I know when you're writing technical stuff, I'm thinking in my mind where I struggle the most with, say, a passive voice is when I'm trying to describe, say, a study on patients and, you know, I want to say the patients were, it'd be tempting to say the patients were given 5 milligrams a day for 6 days, right? So then you got to say, well, who gave it to them? Do I say, so I could change that, researchers gave patients, right? Now I've gotten rid of were given. Or so when you're writing the technical stuff, do you sometimes have the same struggle around, you kind of back yourself in a corner sometimes and you're like, crap, who's doing the action here? How can I make this active voice?
Oh, absolutely. And I wanted to note that many people are trained deliberately to use the passive voice during their schooling. So, for instance, engineers. I work with
so true.
engineers.
Engineers and professors, I'm thinking, right?
Yeah, they think the proper way to write is, is or was were. There's never anybody doing anything in there. There's never any actors. Everything is a machine, especially if you're describing an object or a process or something that's a little more, that doesn't have people involved with
it. It's tricky.
Yeah, and I do agree that you can't completely get rid of the passive voice. When I do when I get the metrics from Word, you know, if I see something where I've got 20% passive voice or 16%,
right, you know you're in trouble then.
I know I can do more, but if it's 8 or 9 or 10 or 11%, I don't get too worried about that because, for instance, in something like a white paper, there's many sentences that are going to be like, there are 5 main reasons why you would want to buy this product.
Right.
That's considered a passive.
I would say when I'm writing, describing someone who had sent out a letter for a recall notice on a car, and clearly they did not want the car to be recalled. They didn't want people bringing it back. It was going to cost them money. So the sentence said something like, you may experience sudden hood fly up, right? So we said, you know, if you read something like that, you're like, yeah, I guess I should get the car into the shop, you know, in the next 10 days or so. Well, you turn that to the active voice, and it says, your hood will fly up, you won't be able to see, you'll crash the car, and you'll die. Well, you read that, and you think, I got to get this thing in tomorrow. Nobody touched the car. And that's the difference between active and passive voice. So that you are absolutely right, Gordon. I think there is a higher level that we can use with a white paper, but when I'm talking to consumers, I've gotten my hands slapped by my mentors for going above 2% on passive voice, and that takes some creativity, let me tell you.
Yeah.
So let's jump on.
Oh, okay.
No, it's all right. Go ahead. Can you make sure that you've got your mic? I'm hearing you kind of fade out and fade back in. We're getting all our first of the year gremlins out on this call, people. That means there'll be nothing else that will go wrong the rest of the year. Wanted to say something real quick, Gordon?
Yeah, I was going to say the classic example of a passive sentence is mistakes were made. And this is the way politicians talk, you know, mistakes were made. Well, who the heck actually did something wrong? Well, they were just made. So that's the kind of thing you want to watch out for in any kind of copy you write for any kind of client.
The next principle is use definite, specific, concrete language. And the way I like to say this is you've got to give your readers some juicy details to hang on to. And here's how the book phrases it. Prefer the specific to the general, the definite to the vague, the concrete to the abstract. It rained every day for a week is better than a period of unfavorable weather set in. The greatest writers are effective largely because they deal in particulars and report the details that matter. Their words call up pictures. It is not that every detail is given, but that all the significant details are given, and with such accuracy and vigor that readers in imagination can project themselves onto the scene. And I think this is so important because we want our readers to experience this with us. We want them to be engaged and picture themselves in the copy. But you have to be careful because if you give too many details, then either I can get bored with all the description or I lose that connection because you've gotten so specific that I'm saying this is not me. But if you give just enough details, then I can identify with that. And I'll give a quick example. I was working on a health magalog recently, and we had all these sort of little home cures for things. And so we had this home cure for hemorrhoids. And instead of just giving this sort of like one sentence saying like, got hemorrhoids, use, you know, whatever, I was trying to give a specific example and paint a picture. So I created this little blurb, and it said, when you're driving across the country to get to your daughter's wedding and you've been behind the wheel for 16 hours straight and you get out and you're walking like John Wayne, what do you do? Now, in my first version, I said, when you're driving your RV across country for 16 hours straight. And everyone who read it circled RV and said, well, you lost me at RV because I don't have an RV. I was with you that I might be driving across country to go to a wedding or a family reunion or an event. So I took that out and I left in the specific situation that I had created because everyone could identify with being in a car for, 18 hours straight and getting out and walking like John Wayne because your hemorrhoids were killing you. But not everybody owned an RV. So I think that's like, to me, I try to remember that in my mind as that balance between too many details or not enough details. And I'm thinking that you must run into this a lot in white papers too because you're describing pretty complicated things.
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes a client wants to put in everything in the kitchen sink, and it's
of course they do.
Yeah, and it's just a killer. So you've got to take them by the hand and guide them and say, let's just put in the top 3 features here, and then if people are interested, the idea of content is to get a prospect engaged with the company so that they want to find out more. The idea is not to load them over the head with everything you could possibly tell them, because then what are you going to say next? So, I mean, that's something that some clients need a little bit of help understanding.
And I think that's a really good way to think about that, which is how much information do they need to be engaged and interested, but still leaving something out. I mean, this is the art of a sidebar when I work on these magalogs. You never want to give the whole thing away because I still want you hungry to buy the book. And in your case, you want them hungry to engage with the client. You want them to call for information. You want them to take the next step. So it's that fine balance between giving enough and leaving just a little bit out. People have compared it to the dance with the sort of like big fans and the feathers, right? You see a little bit of ankle here and there, but you don't want to display the whole thing, right? Because then what's left? You've got to have a little mystery there.
Yeah.
Let's move on to your next one, Gordon, which is Principle 22. Place the emphatic words of a sentence at the end. And you sent me a fantastic example of this, which I think really points this out. So I'm going to ask you to kind of take us through this here.
Okay, and this may not be the best example in the world, but it's one that I came up with. And really, this is a writing tip. This is a tip that I read in the book, but I didn't rediscover it or start to use it for years, for decades after I read the book. So writers, pay attention. This is a really effective little writing tip. So here's the first example. With Acme Anti-Rust, you can keep any metal-hulled boat in the ocean for 2 or 3 years longer, thanks to the patented formula that fights rust. So there's a sort of ho-hum sentence of version 1. And the problem is, the key benefit about this 2 or 3 years is just buried in the middle of it. What people remember is the beginning and the end. We remember the edges of things. We remember the borders. We don't remember the middle so much. And this also applies to...
I love that. It's a great way to put that. I just want to pause and say that again. We remember, so everyone, that's a great little way to put this rule in our brains. I love that. We remember the edges of things. We remember the borders, the beginning and the ends of sentences.
Yeah. So here's a sentence with the most important benefit pulled back to the end. The patented formula in Acme Anti-Rust fights rust so effectively that you can keep any metal-hulled boat in the ocean for 2 to 3 years longer. So what sticks in your mind? It's that 2 or 3 years. Holy moly, I want to buy that. I'm going to be able to leave my boat in the water for 2 or 3 years longer. That's huge. you know.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. You really get how that drives that home. And in the book, he takes it even one step further, and he says, you know, think of this also in terms of paragraphs. Where do you want the zinger of your paragraph? And I think of that in terms of sidebars. Sometimes the shock of a sidebar is, you know, in the first sentence, like you said at the beginning. Sometimes, you know, you want to say something like, did you know a tablespoon of peanut butter can cure Alzheimer's? It's true. Scientists have discovered. You know, that's so shocking and absurd and unheard of that you would stop and read that, right? Other times you start out slowly and you're like, you know, if anyone has cancer, you know how awful it is, how debilitating, and then you describe the whole thing, and then you say, but now there's hope, scientists have discovered this thing, and then you might describe it, and then your final sentence might be, and in fact, you know, in stage 3 clinical trials, this, you know, kumquat cured 5 out of 10 cancers or something. And that's, again, that's where you've got like the judge with the gavel pounding it home at the end. And so I think this is true not just in sentences, but I think you can find a way in which you can hear that rhythm in your paragraphs and even in your copy. You know, at what point do you make these big benefit statements and how do you drive them home?
Yeah, and you know, another example of that, I mean, I don't usually write sales letters, but I know how powerful the PS is. And it's because it's the last thing that sticks in your mind. It's the last word. And so
many writers forget that or don't want to bother with it because, let's face it, by the time you finish writing 26 pages of copy, you want to, you know, have a bottle of bourbon and go to bed, right? The last thing you want to do is write a powerful PS. But I know many writers who actually say they write the PS first, right? Because that's their sort of like summing up, that's their big punch. And I think leaving off a PS can be dangerous because it is the last thing you're going to see, and people will be drawn to it, and they do read them. That is a great point.
It certainly applies to the web. The way people read on the web, they skim and scan and skip and scroll down to the bottom. And so you've got to put a zinger at the bottom because they're probably going to scroll down to that. And a lot of people in print, you know, if you see the way a lot of magazines do, they'll put some kind of columnist on the very back inside page, so that and the reason they do that is because they want people to flip through the whole magazine and see all the ads on their way to that funny columnist who's right at the very back. So it's a tried and true principle to define your edges carefully, your start and your end.
I love it. So that's a really great takeaway from this call. I really like that. I wanted to talk just briefly about style, and this is sort of one of those nebulous, kind of hard to wrap your hands around thing. But I recently had sort of an aha moment, to quote Oprah, on this idea of style. And so I want to take just a minute to talk about this and to share a little bit with our listeners. So style is an increment in writing. When we speak of Fitzgerald's style, we don't mean his command of the relative pronoun. We mean the sound his words make on paper. All writers, by the way they use the language, reveal something of their spirits, their habits, their capacities, and their biases. And I loved, this is a little example from the book, Hemingway or Faulkner. You can be the first one to take my test here, Gordon. Hemingway or Faulkner. Manuel drank his brandy. He felt sleepy himself. It was too hot to go out into the town. Besides, there was nothing to do. He wanted to see Zorito. He would go to sleep while he waited. Want to take a guess?
It's pretty obvious. And I love those sentences. 4 words, 5 words. I mean, they're just fantastic, you know. And what I joke around with people is that nobody ever complains that you make something too easy to understand.
No, they don't.
You know, well, I read your piece, and the problem is it was just too easy to read. Nobody's ever going to say that. Nobody ever
complains about that. And obviously this is Hemingway, and he's known for his powerful, short sentences. and where he's got all this action. And in fact, there is now an app. You can Google it online. I meant to put it in here, and I didn't find the link yet. I promise I'll post it on our Facebook page. There's an app where you can compare your writing to Hemingway's style. It's like a Hemingway scale, right? And it tells you how close you are. And I think it's just fantastic, because as someone who suffered from Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, I can tell you I will take Hemingway any day than a sentence that says my mother is a fish. But so when we talk about style, I know when we're new to writing, right, the beginner should approach style warily, realizing it is an expression of self, right? And you don't want to, you want to turn away from devices, from tricks. Style is really plainness, simplicity, orderliness, sincerity. So I compare this to someone who's, you know, it's like in fashion, right? You're not trying to put, it's not affectation. It's what naturally comes out as your own style. And I would argue that just as we could tell that Hemingway, not Faulkner, wrote that sentence, that when I read some of the best copywriters in the business, I know who wrote a package. I can pretty much tell you if Clayton Makepeace or one of his apprentices wrote a financial package, because it has a certain style and tone and phrasing that I recognize as Clayton's. I can tell when Paris Lampropoulos wrote a package, because it has this sort of very left-brained, analytical, very scientific, and yet completely engaging and totally readable, and like I can't stop. I just get drugged from paragraph to paragraph to paragraph, even if it's a topic I'm not interested in. Before I know it, I've read the whole thing. And I believe that as copywriters, we start out by imitating our betters, and I'm sure this is true in white papers too. You look to the people who are doing the best in your field. You start out by imitating their style, but then I think you can slowly begin to incorporate that, and after years of writing, you begin to emerge with your own style. Are you more of an emotional writer? Are you more of a sort of facts and figure writers? Are you more of an entertaining writer? Do you have humor in your writing? Do you like a lot of alliteration? Like, you begin to develop your own style. And I will tell you, I've been writing for 10 years, and this magalog that I just finished was really the first time when I began to feel where my own voice could come through a little bit and my own style. And the example is the one that I gave you earlier, which is I had this book of lots of home cures and not a lot to say about them. You know, you don't want to just sort of say, take this for this, this for this, this for this. Is kind of boring. And so I remembered back to my childhood from a great little book called What Do You Say, Dear? That was this book about manners that Maurice Sendak had illustrated. And that's why I came up with this idea to add these little things. You know, what do you do when you've been driving across country for 8 hours and you're to your daughter's wedding? Or I had one, what do you do when you're about to leave on your anniversary cruise and you come down with the flu the day before? So that was my way of taking a little bit of playfulness, a little bit of my own style, and incorporating it into what I know works, which is coming up with something that dramatizes the cure. So I just wondered, Gordon, you know, for you, because I know that we're going to need to move on here, but for you, how do you feel style coming into play in white papers? Because clearly you must have your own style or way of writing, and how does that get intermingled with sort of the how to write a white paper rules?
Well, I guess I'm not sure if I see it the same way that you do or not. One thing I find is that people have to unlearn most of the bad writing habits that they were taught in school. Even if you study like I did, you know, English and philosophy, we're not taught to use specific, vigorous, you know, muscular language. We're taught to use all kinds of qualifiers, and well, it may be true that, you know, it looks like evidence should and you're trying to stretch it out and get to your 12 pages that the prof wanted you to hand in. And so I think that the first thing I had to do was unlearn all that stuff. And luckily I did enough journalism where you quickly have that beaten out of you. But I think that there's a kind of hurdle. There's a kind of style that people that have written a lot of copy all kind of get to, which is in the last sentence here: plainness, simplicity, orderliness, sincerity. There's a kind of conversational, I'm just here telling you about something because I think it's important that you hear this. And I always imagine sitting down and, you know, having a coffee or a beer with somebody and just chit-chatting across the table. And I kind of try to write that way. And it's so different from the way most business write. You know, most people in business are writing reports, and their websites sometimes are really verbose and don't tell you anything. And they use the passive voice, and they use the longest words they can find. And really, it's sometimes it's a clash when I hand in something in my style, and the reviewers all want to put back in the big words, and so it's a bit of a push and pull. But I think that there's one definite hurdle there that every successful writer should get over, which is to write in a friendly, helpful, plain, sincere, conversational style. And if you can do that, I think that's most of the way there. You know.
I think that's great advice. And now let's dig into a few examples of how do you do that? How do you keep this simple, non-ornate, and what we're calling robust, hard-hitting, muscular language? And this is one that you talked about, Gordon, as being one of your pet peeves, if you will, is to avoid the use of qualifiers like rather, very, little, pretty. And I love how he describes this. These are the leeches that infest the pound of prose, sucking the blood of words. And you sent me a great example of this from a programmer code that I wondered if you could talk about a little bit.
Yeah, and I actually got this. It was interesting. I actually got this from a handbook on how to write to be translated. And it was saying, don't use that because when they're translated, they can mean a completely different thing in another language. But I would say they can be pretty meaningless even in English. So
even in English, right?
This example is, you know, how long would it take you to develop a new system for the company? And the programmer says, oh, we could do that pretty quickly. So what does that mean? You know, if there's 6 people sitting around a table, they're all going to think that means something different. They might think it would mean a few days, a week, a few weeks, a month, a few months, a year, a few years. I mean, what does it mean? It's absolutely meaningless. And so, you know, numbers are the alternative to qualifiers. If you don't have a number, if you have a number, or you can find a number, use a number, and then that gives everybody a far better idea. And that's an example of using a specific instead of a generic. You know, qualified, meaningless, empty, generic term.
Yeah. And again, this is something that you can use like very and little and big. Those are things you can search your copy for and find right away. Mm-hmm. This is another one that you mentioned briefly, which is avoid fancy words, right? You don't need those elaborate, pretentious words. And you had a great example. I wonder if you could share with us about medical jargon, which I loved.
Yeah, well, you know, what are you going to say, a myocardial infarction, or are you going to say heart attack? You know, right. If you're writing for doctors, of course, you might say myocardial infarction, but look at how many syllables that is. Look at how many letters that is compared to heart attack. And if you don't know how to avoid big words, then just think about the way doctors talk. Think about all those Latin and Greek words, those words with all those syllables and these roots that don't mean anything in English. They come from another language, from Latin or Greek. And then think about the short little, lively little Anglo-Saxon words, and you can always, well, generally substitute a shorter one for a longer one. And the thing is, the shorter your words, and actually the fewer syllables you use in each word, and the actual fewer letters you use in each word, the better your readability statistics are going to be, the easier your writing to absorb. So you really want to get rid of any big word that you don't need and use a shorter, more direct word.
And I think the other thing is what do those different words mean? And I had to crack up when he ends his thing by saying, never call a stomach a tummy without good reason. Because I was talking to a friend of mine, David Deutsch, the other day, and he has a control where the first time it went out, it was, why does your tummy still hurt? And the language was sort of like, oh, you poor baby, you're feeling miserable, you know, what can we do to fix this? The second time, he tested into why your stomach still hurts, and that had a much more scientific kind of opening, like here's the reasons that cause stomach pain, and here's what you can do about it, and here's the foods that upset you. And so again, when you hear tummy, you think of this little kid. When you hear stomach, it sounds much more official, scientific. So it's not even long words, $10 versus 10 center. It's also what kind of emotion or connection do you want to evoke? Because the stomach evokes something very different than tummy, you know? And I think that's critical. I loved this one. And this one is one that I often struggle with. Be clear. And I think this is a great rule. When you are hopelessly mired in a sentence, it is best to start fresh. Do not try to fight your way through against the terrible odds of syntax. Usually what is wrong is that the construction has become too involved at some point. The sentence needs to be broken apart and replaced by 2 or more shorter sentences. And Gordon, this is exactly what you were pointing out in that little passage from Hemingway, which is that too many times I see writers try to cram 3 clauses into one sentence, right? And I get a headache before I've lost track of the whole point of the sentence by the time I get to the end of it. And
well, especially on the web, right? Especially the way people read on the web, where we're all kind of sloppy readers that are only half there, and we're distracted, and we're skimming and scanning and skipping. I don't use any of these roundabout sentences anymore that say, not only does the da-da-da-da-da-da-da, but the da-da-da-da.
But it also da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, right. I think that connection to the web is really interesting because it's true. You don't have, this is not a medical journal that a doctor is compelled to sit down and he has to read. No one has to read this stuff on the web, and they're busy and they're distracted. And if you're going to make them work to find the point of a sentence, they are gone. They're already ordering shoes from Zappos before they got to the end of your sentence. Okay, I'm trying. Oh, here we go. This is one I thought was interesting that you picked. It's not something I had really thought of, and I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about this idea of why you don't want to inject opinion into things.
Well, as they say, we all have opinions about everything, and I think this is a sign of a beginning writer who will take an assignment as a chance to air their opinions. And the thing is, if you're writing for a client or you're writing, for a publication, unless you're somebody who's a big name, and let's face it, most of us aren't, people have got their own opinions. They don't care so much about you. I come to this because this is probably the worst problem, one of the biggest failures of a lot of white papers. The sponsors are putting out all these claims with no proof. All they're saying is, we've got the best. You know, we're way ahead of everybody else. You know, we've got a better idea. We've got a better solution. You'll save money. You'll save time. They're just putting out this empty hot air as kind of assertions without any proof. So, you know, an opinion to me is a view without any proof to back it up. An argument is a
Not
view
only
with,
that, your reader might disagree with you, and then you've lost them.
Absolutely, yeah. If you start talking about politics or religion or sex or something where people are really polarized, then, you know, you'll come across one line and they'll be gone, as you were saying. They'll be off getting shoes from somebody else. You'll have lost a sale. You'll have lost their attention. So I think that it's, you know, if you're trying to build a point, build an argument. Don't just toss in your opinion. That's lazy. You know, put in an opinion backed up by lots of facts and evidence and numbers.
I think that's a great point. I know that we're coming up close on time, but we did take a little break in the middle when we had our audio difficulties. So, Gordon, I'm going to ask, are you okay to go, say, just 10 minutes over to have time to wrap up, or do you have another commitment right at 4?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. So, everyone, if you'll just hang in there and stay with us, we're going to move through the rest of these very quickly, but again, thanks for hanging in there. I threw this in just because I think another mistake that I made when I was first starting out is I knew that I wanted to use metaphor, right? I knew the power of comparing a complicated thing to something else, especially, I'm sure you've run across this in white papers. For me, it was in medical writing, working if I'm trying to describe some part of the body, like how the cartilage breaks down or defect in the heart, and I'm trying to explain this so I can explain the mechanism of action of my cure. It was often easy to say, well, you know, it's sort of like your dishwasher, or it's sort of like how someone does something. But what I didn't understand, and one of my mentors pointed out to me, is he said, Marcella, you keep coming up with these metaphors that actually take more time and are more complicated to explain than the thing itself. He's like, you only want to use a metaphor if it simplifies something, if it's easy for everybody to grasp, if it's sort of a one-to-one fit, and you can say, it's just like when you start your car. You have to have if the battery's not charged, it won't start. He's like, it has to be that simple. You can't be explaining, you know, how the engine works as a metaphor for how this cure works, because nobody cares how the engine works. And so I just threw this in there to say, yes, it's a good idea to use metaphors and simile when you've got a complicated thing and you're trying to make it simple. Just be aware that it's got to be a really simple, easy to grasp metaphor if you just defeated the purpose of using it. And I don't know if you've seen that in white papers also, Gordon.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of my pet peeves is mixed metaphors, and I'll tell you what I do about those. I mean, I think a lot of writers just, as they write, they in their first draft, they just drop in whatever metaphor comes in their mind, and then when they go back through it, they may be going off in 10 different directions. And what I say is pick a master metaphor. That's
interesting.
Pull the whole piece together. So say, I remember one example. It was something about 3 things that your e-commerce website has to have. It has to be reliable, available, and flexible, or something like that. And I came up with the metaphor of a triple threat player, which is a baseball player who could hit and run and field, right? And
got it. Yeah.
And then I was comparing. So through the whole piece, I was comparing. Okay, this is when the batter gets up to hit. It's somebody's ready to buy. They want to be able to buy. It's sort of like that. That tied it all together from the first draft.
And it fit, right? You can see how a batter getting up to hit is just like the buyer ready to pull the trigger. I mean, that fits. You're not forcing a round peg in a square hole there. To use another metaphor.
Well, we do that. That's the way our minds work as writers. But I think when we revise, one thing to look for is metaphors going off in all different directions. It's like a match is falling into a box of fireworks, and they're just firing off all over the place. You know, it doesn't really give you much power. But if you
and it confuses your reader. It confuses your reader.
Yeah.
I love that idea of a master metaphor. I think that's just great. Something, and it doesn't always work, right? Sometimes you have to admit that there isn't a metaphor that can wrap the whole thing together, and you're better off just calling it like it is and walking through it. But when you can come up with one, it is really powerful. And so it's just something to be aware of. And so I like where he says sparingly, just being aware of it. Of course, this is the one that that you and I both, you know, said. This is it. This is like the bottom line: revise and rewrite. It's really this and the slide we're going to talk about next is really what is the difference. What makes the difference between a mediocre writer and a great writer? It's not in the first draft. Nobody's first draft is amazing. It's in the revision. It's in the revision. And I loved how you phrased this, Gordon. I wondered if you might share where you were talking about the text singing.
Yeah, well, I think that this is the revising and doing some careful rework and doing lots of drafts before I send something into my client or my editor. This is the secret of my success. And I don't think I'm a brilliant writer, but I think I'm patient enough to do lots of drafts. And I've known writers that send in their first drafts. And I'm telling you, that's not the way to success, because your second draft the next morning is going to be better, maybe a little polish in the afternoon. It'll be noticeably better than your first draft, and that will just carry you further. So I think what I was saying was in the end, you want the text to sing, you know, or at least not sound like a buzzsaw hacking through cement. You know, and,
I believe I am guilty of the buzzsaw hacking through cement at times. I will definitely, and this is where procrastination can kill you, because procrastination robs you of the time to revise and rewrite. And believe me, I am the queen of procrastination, so I know what I am talking about here, people. And that is the biggest downfall, whatever you want to say, of procrastination, is you lose the time when you're polishing and perfecting and turning that coal into a diamond. And so you can be just as good of a writer as somebody else, but when you don't leave in the time to revise and rewrite, they're going to beat you every time, like it or not.
Yeah, good point.
That's my lesson on do not procrastinate, mostly for myself. You all get to just listen in as I'm talking to myself. And this is, I love this. This is from the introduction here. And I think this, if I had to say there's one thing that I hope everyone in this call will take away from this book, this is it. This is like the gem at the heart of this book. And he calls it 59 words that could change the world when he's talking about Strunk. This is White talking about his Professor Strunk, and he says that this is how Strunk would lecture them in their class. Vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words. A paragraph, no unnecessary sentences. For the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines and a machine no unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer make all sentences short or avoid all details and treat subjects only in outline, but that every word tell. And I know, Gordon, you're as passionate about this omitting needless words, and in fact, I think you said that was your #1 favorite rule in the entire book, was omit needless words.
Yeah, and the part I really relate to, I'm so glad that you put in this quote, because the part I really relate to is a machine shouldn't have any unnecessary parts. I mean, that just is so classic, and of course we all agree with that, right? Like, what if you're designing a machine, you're not going to stick in something that doesn't function, or that could be replace 6 pieces with 1 piece, you know, and then a piece of art, you know. You don't have extra lines all over the place just obscuring the point of the drawing. You have a nice drawing and is doing something, and it really is so true for writing as well. Like, get rid of the unnecessary words, get rid of the unnecessary sentences, and this is a major part of rewriting. Compressing. Your first draft can be long, and then you compress it down to the most telling words. And this applies to any kind of writing. You know, who's the writer that wrote Get Shorty and those sort of funny crime books?
Not Dashiell Hammett. No,
he's more modern than him. I forget. He just died a couple of years ago. Our audience will know who I'm talking about. He wrote a lot of crime books, but one of his you know, classic pieces of advice was leave out the boring parts, you know, when you're writing a novel.
And I know when you emailed me, you mentioned Leonard Cohen, and I just read, Katie Yeakel gave me a fantastic book called Songwriters on Songwriting. And there's this great interview with Leonard Cohen in there where he literally has journals and journals and journals of lyrics that get boiled down to, you know what, I don't know, 100 and some words, maybe less, in one song. But to get to that song, he's written thousands and thousands of pages in these journals, whittling them down. And I'm a big fan of Leonard Cohen's music, and I can believe that he has to do that to get those gems of lines that come through. I mean, poets are the same way, right? Thousands of words to carve that down into this little essence. And I think you talked about Dr. Seuss, right?
Dr. Seuss, I watched a documentary about Dr. Seuss, and it said that he was sketching and writing all day long, all day long. And he would write up to 1,000 pages of rough sketches and rough scribbles that would be boiled down to one of his children's books. And his children's books are 60 or 70 pages long, like I do not like them saying
Right.
They sound like he dashed them off, but no way. It's like making maple syrup. I'm in a part of the world where they make a lot of maple syrup. It
takes a whole lot of sap to boil that down, doesn't it?
It's something like 40 to 1, 40 gallons of sap.
Oh my God.
Final maple syrup. So I'm not saying we can do that in our writing, but we should really try to make things more concise and more brief, and everybody will appreciate that.
I know we are over time, and I'm conscious, but so what if anyone has a really pressing question, we could probably take one, maybe two. If not, we'll plow ahead. Cameron, you want to check and see if anyone has sent in a question or if we should just move on?
Absolutely. I do have a few questions here. I had a couple people write in about the Hemingway app. They said it was HemingwayApp.com.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so just no spaces. Hemingway app with 2 P's, I assume, .com.
You got it.
Perfect.
And also, somebody is wondering, what is a master metaphor, or is that just a term that you use?
Yeah, that's just an idea I came up with. I haven't really Googled it to see if anybody has it, but it's the idea is that the top-level metaphor that ties everything else together. So it could be something like a baseball game, and then within the baseball game, you've got pitchers and hitters and runners and equipment and gloves and the stadium and everything. So it's just the idea, the area, the genre, the kind of container for all the other metaphors to make sure they all line up. That's how I think of it.
And I believe it's in the accelerated course for copywriting. Remember, and there's also a separate book, The Architecture. Where is Katie when I need her? I believe it's The Architecture of Persuasion, where Mark Ford uses a metaphor of a house and talks you all the way through, or he uses the metaphor of romancing your prospect and what do you do when you're dating and what do you bring to, so that is taking a metaphor for an entire process that you can hang that on so that everyone can follow you all the way along. And I think the difference between a master metaphor and a metaphor that you would just use in the copy is, you might, I'm trying to think of ones that we use all the time, tight-fisted, right? Or you could say she was tighter than, whatever. You might just use that to describe someone who was penny pinching, right? Or we'll say, like winning a lottery ticket, right? So when I write about options copy and I talk about these trades that are very low cost to enter, but the chances of them coming true are way out there, right? I'll call it a lottery ticket type trade, and I'll say that you're kind of wasting your money because it's got about the same odds of happening as a lottery ticket, so why would you play that option? So again, that's just in that sentence, but I'm not building my whole piece of copy around that metaphor, versus the ones you're talking about, Gordon, are really powerful enough and complex enough to contain an entire white paper, an entire system.
Yeah, I guess so.
I love that difference. I think that's a really great way to think about that. So now, as you guys know by now, I'd like to give you all a little homework assignment, and I'm really encouraging people, let's all make this our resolution this year to get on our Facebook page and to begin to engage with each other after we go through the books. Let's really try to do our homework, because that's when the learning from the book really becomes part of your sinew and your blood and your bones, okay? So here's what I want you to try to do. Doesn't matter whether you're going to actually turn this into your client or not. I want you to take a piece of copy. It can be a B2B ad. It can be a white paper. It can be a magalog. It can be a video sales letter, any topic. And I want you to take the piece of copy and challenge yourself to cut it in half. Cut it in half. You might still be giving the client 20 pages, but then I want you to challenge yourself, could I be just as compelling, get my point across, and make this just as powerful if I had 10 pages? And that's when you really force yourself to look at every word and see if it was absolutely necessary. And then I'd love for people to just post on our Facebook page, what was that like? Like, what did you notice? Did you notice that you had a lot of varies in there? Were you adding qualifiers? Were you throwing around adjectives and adverbs like crazy that really weren't necessary and that were sort of disguising weak verbs and that you could replace with one powerful verb? You know, really look at that and see how you challenge yourself. Take on that challenge and then post and tell me about that. I want to quickly announce that next month we're going to do one of my favorite books of all time, which is by Anne Lamott, and it is called Bird by Bird. And I'm going to be joined by the ever wonderful Jennifer Stevens, and many of you have seen her speak over the years at boot camp. I try to always attend her sessions when I can because she always has such practical advice. There's always something that I can go back and implement right away. So Jenna's going to join us for Bird by Bird. And this is not a book for copywriters per se, very similar to our book this month. It's a book for all writers of any type. And here's another one of my favorite resources for those of you who don't know about it. There is a fantastic blog, and I am not a big person who reads a lot of stuff online. This is one of the few I read all the time, and it's brainpickings.org. It's just, I could go on and on about this. Google it. There's a New York Times article about it. It's fantastic. So there was a recent article, 15 resolutions for 2015 from some of humanity's greatest minds, and they picked Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird because she writes about how perfectionism paralyzes us and how to let go of perfectionism and get to what she calls the crappy first draft, or at Copy Harvest we call it the SFD. And I am someone who has suffered from procrastination really caused by perfectionism, by getting paralyzed by that. This is one of the reasons why I dearly love this book. And Jen Stevens, when I wrote to her and said, you know, hey, will you do this book with me, because I knew she was a big Anne Lamott fan, she said one of the reasons she loves it, and I agree with her, is that Anne Lamott is refreshingly frank, self-deprecating. She's humorous. This book is easy, fun. You will feel like you are a member of the tribe when you finish reading this book. So I really hope that you will dig into this book and join us, because really what she talks about, how she works as a writer, where she gets the material, how she's productive, that is just as useful for us as it is for budding fiction writers. And it's, I love how she says it's chatty, it's catty, it's a fantastic read. And that's going to be next month. And I want to announce our winners who will receive a free copy of Bird by Bird from Amazon.com, compliments of the Great Books Club. Jeanette Schur, Alana Reynolds, Dave Veronikar, please forgive my brutal pronunciation here, David Groska, Denise Menz, Jeff Barnhart, Steve Garner, Lisa Preston, Elizabeth Beecham, and Chris Donnelly. Congratulations, and your books will be on the way. March's selection is Mastery. Then in April, we move on to How to Win Your Case by Jerry Spence, which is from a trial lawyer about how to build your case and persuade. Then we have The Big Leap, which is a fantastic book about reaching beyond what you might think of as your upper limit, how we set an upper limit on what we think we can achieve in our lives and how to make that big leap and break through it. And then in June, we'll have On Writing, with, which is a fantastic memoir by Stephen King. And our host will be John Ford. Monica Day will be joining me for The Big Leap. I want to thank everyone, but especially Gordon, I want to thank you for suggesting this book in the first place. I think it was just fantastic and really brought home to me a lot of the key points of good writing that are so easily for me to slip into bad habits. It was like a good reminder for me of what makes for good, solid writing. And I loved your insights, and I really appreciated you bringing this book to our attention, because I think it was, it really is part of the canon. It's like a classic, and you are right. It will stay on my desk.
Well, great. Glad to hear it. We're coming up to the 100th anniversary of the first beginnings of this book, too, and not too many books on style are listened to 100 years after they are published.
Oh, that's very true. You know, I wanted to catch you right before you go. I just wanted to wrap up by saying when I first jumped on the call, Cameron mentioned that you had been busy recording. Is it a new course? Can you give us a little tease for what you've been working on with AWAI? I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, well, there's a new program that's being launched next week. It's called the Crash Course in B2B Content. And what this is kind of like a, Psychology 101, kind of a survey course, an overview of the 12 most popular types of content, from blog posts to white papers. So
it sounds fascinating.
So
and this is next week?
Yeah, it's going to be available next week. And it's really aimed at writers who are being asked to write in a different format that they may have never done before. You may be writing blogs, but suddenly you get a chance to write a case study. And in 1 hour, you can find out all the basics you need to know if you want to write case studies, if you want to give it a try, and some of the tips and greatest hits of how to do a good job with samples and a walkthrough of one sample in detail, and really everything you need to know to get your feet wet with each format.
Oh, wow, that sounds terrific. Do we have a title yet?
The Crash Course in B2B Content.
The Crash Course in B2B Content. So for any of you who are interested in the B2B space, you got a lot of tips on this call about how to be an effective writer of white papers. I know I learned a lot because it's an area that I don't specialize in, so I found that very helpful. And if you want to go to the next step, this Crash Course sounds like a perfect beginning for someone who's really interested in B2B and wants that flexibility and versatility that we talked about in the beginning, of having different structures that you can use and rely upon. So I'll be looking for that next week. I'm very excited to hear that, and I'm glad you're continuing to work with us to educate writers in the B2B space, especially folks like me who haven't worked in that space before. I'm really interested to learn a little bit more about it and become more versatile myself. And thanks so much for hanging in there with me for another 18 minutes. And I look forward to seeing all of you on the Facebook page with your 50% reduction in words and hearing how that went. And I really am excited to see you all back next month. That would be a little fast for me. Next month with Jen Stevens, and we'll be talking about Bird by Anne Lamott. Thanks again so much for joining us today, Gordon. I'm really glad to have had you as a guest, and I really enjoyed it.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Take care, everyone. See you next time.